The epidermis is composed of stratified epithelial tissue. And if you remember from our discussion about epithelial tissue, we said that those cells are tightly packed in together and they are connected to each other. When we look at the epithelial tissue of the epidermis, we can really see that tight connection between the cells. The cells are actually attached to each other and to a layer of material at the bottom of the epidermis, at the deepest level. That very bottom layer gets a name. We call it the basement membrane, or the BM. It's not the kind of membrane that you think about surrounding a cell. It's a fibrous kind of a membrane that serves as a foundation for the epidermis to sit on. So there are connections to the basement membrane, and there are connections in between each individual epithelial cell in the epidermis. These connections that I'm talking about are called desmosomes and hemidesmosomes. Now, if you look at the drawing on this slide, this actually represents cells not in the skin, not in the epidermis, but in the intestine. And I took this picture into our lecture because I like the way the artist has drawn the desmosomes and the hemidesmosomes. So again, these are not epithelial cells, these are intestinal cells, but the idea is the same. Underneath the intestinal cells, there's a basement membrane. In this drawing, there's one intestinal cell right here. There's a half of a cell here and another half of a cell here. Now, the artist is showing us that there are these strange looking connections between these two cells. And there's also one between these two cells. These are desmosomes. The actual physical connection is right here. That's where the two cells are basically stuck together. And then you can see there are these sort of projections of the desmosome that reach into the cell itself, sort of like anchors. I like to think of desmosomes as being analogous to two Lego bricks that come together and join together. Now, the only difference between one of these desmosomes and a hemidesmosome is that the hemidesmosomes are basically one half of the desmosomes. Here's the connection point to the basement membrane, and here are those anchors reaching into the cell. In fact, hemi translates as half. So a hemidesmosome is essentially a half of a desmosome. We're going to find these structures in the epidermis between the epithelial cells. The desmosomes will connect the epithelial cells to each other, and the hemidesmosomes will connect them to their basement membrane. Now, as I said a few minutes ago, the specialized epithelial cells in the epidermis are the keratinocytes. And as they move from the basement membrane upwards through the different layers, they're going to have to break these connections. These connections have to literally break down in order to allow each individual cell to move upwards through the epidermis until they reach the top layer where they will eventually be shed off. And remember, the time involved from the birth of a brand new keratinocyte to the time that it is shed off from the top layer of the skin is about a month. On this slide, you're looking at a light microscope image of the epithelium in the integument. So these are all keratinocytes. These are all specialized epithelial cells. They're specialized because they're capable of producing this protein called keratin. Now, it's possible to see different layers of cells in here, but that's not why I included this image in here for us. Instead, I put it in because you can see desmosomes in this image. Everywhere there's an individual cell, such as right here, you can see the nucleus inside the cell, and then you can also see this sort of a white or light colored ring around the cell. And then I think you can just make out these little lines, these little stripes in that light colored area. These are the desmosomes. And the desmosomes are connecting one cell to another cell. So you can see all of these cells in here are connected to each other, tightly connected to each other, packed in and attached to one another. So let's take a look now at these individual layers of cells that are in the epidermis. Remember, we use the word stratified to mean layered. So another term that you should be familiar with is just the term strata. A strata is just the plural of the word stratum, and a stratum is just a layer. So we're going to talk about the strata, or the layers of the epidermis, from the basement layer all the way up to the surface. And that's what this drawing is showing us on the slide. The surface of the skin would be up here, and the basement membrane, which is not drawn here, would be located right here underneath the deepest layer of cells. So starting at that deepest layer, there is a single layer of cells called the stratum basale. Then there is a multi-layered section called the stratum spinosum. On top of that, there's a layer called the stratum granulosum, then a layer called the stratum lucidum, and then finally a layer called the stratum corneum. And you'll notice that the artist has labeled the stratum corneum as containing some dead keratinocytes. I'm sure you're already familiar with the fact that the very uppermost layers of cells on the surface of your skin are dead cells, and they flake off relatively easily. The cells that are deeper are living cells. These are the specialized epithelial cells, the keratinocytes, and also a variety of other cells that we will talk about. Here is one of the melanocytes that I mentioned earlier that secretes that pigment called melanin. On this slide, you're looking at a section through the integument under a light microscope. So you'll notice right away that this upper part of the image is very darkly stained, and this lower part is very lightly stained. Everything from this layer right here upwards. So everywhere that you see the dark magenta color, this is epidermis. Everything below that, the more light color, is dermis. Now, in the very center of the image, they have purposefully overlaid this bar here to show us where each layer begins and ends. So the single layer of dark pink cells at the bottom of this whole epidermis is the stratum basale. A single layer of cells right at the bottom of the epidermis called the stratum basale. Above that, in multiple layers, is the stratum spinosum. Then there's a thin layer that stains very darkly, called the stratum granulosum. Then a layer called stratum lucidum, and then a layer stratum corneum up at the top. So let's take a minute to talk about that base layer, the stratum basale. This is a single layer of cells, and when you look at these epithelial cells, the shape that they have is cuboidal. Now, sometimes when you look under the microscope, they look almost halfway between the cuboidal shape and the columnar shape. So some people refer to that as a low columnar, halfway between a cube and a column, in other words. That stratum basale, that bottom layer of the epidermis, is tightly attached to a basement membrane underneath it with those hemidesmosomes. Now, what kind of cells are in this single layer? Well, most of the cells are those stem cells that I mentioned earlier. These are keratinocyte stem cells. When these cells divide, they produce two new cells. One of the new cells is going to be a stem cell, and the other new cell is going to be a keratinocyte. Now, in addition to these stem cells, there are two other types of cells in this layer that you should be familiar with. One are melanocytes, the cells that produce and store melanin. And the other are the Merkel cells, those tactile cells that I mentioned earlier. Remember, melanin is the pigment, the primary pigment of our skin. It helps determine the color of our skin. I'll show you in a moment that melanocytes have a very unusual shape. They're referred to as dendritic cells because they have these strange processes, these strange extensions of their membrane that sort of reach up and in between the other cells. It's the melanocytes that will respond to UV exposure and will begin to make more and more and more melanin as we are exposed to more and more sunlight. It's important to know that while melanin is the primary pigment in human skin, there are two other pigment-like chemicals that can contribute to the color of our skin. One of them is beta-carotene. Beta-carotene, which comes out of our dietary consumption of yellow and orange and red vegetables. Beta-carotene can be stored in human skin and can give human skin sort of an orangey color. I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. The other thing that can contribute to the color of your skin is the hemoglobin that's in your blood. Remember, there's an extensive network of capillaries in the integument, and those capillaries are loaded with blood. And that blood contains hemoglobin. And just by its nature, hemoglobin is colored. It has anywhere from a red color down to a very dark cranberry, almost blue color. And that color can contribute to the color of your skin. Here's another drawing of the integument and a nice image of the stratum basale. So in this drawing, the epidermis is this region, and the dermis is down here. So here is that single layer of cells called the stratum basale. Most of these cells, the dark purple cells, are keratinocyte stem cells. But you can also see a melanocyte here, and you can see a Merkel cell right here. Notice how the melanocyte has extensions of its membrane reaching up like little fingers, little tentacles, into the higher layers of cells. Melanocytes are going to produce melanin. They're going to store melanin, and they're going to secrete melanin up into these higher layers. One of the things we're going to be doing in today's lecture is talking about some disease conditions that are related to the integument. And one of those conditions is called albinism. Now, albinism is actually a group of disorders. These are inherited disorders of the recessive variety, and they are disorders of the production of melanin. In other words, people who inherit albinism do not make normal levels of melanin, and so they don't have color in their skin. Now, in addition to their skin, it also affects their hair and their eyes. It turns out that melanin is critical not only for the pigment associated with the human eye, but also for the function of the optic nerve. So people that suffer with albinism have a variety of skin-related problems due to the lack of melanin, and also a variety of ocular problems due to the lack of melanin. You can see the images on the slide depicting individuals who suffer with albinism. And again, the most marked thing about them is they have very little to no color in their skin. They will have a very light, almost silvery blue eye, and their hair will essentially be white. Albinism can affect all different types of people, including African Americans. The skin-related problems of albinism are related to this function that melanin provides for us, which is protection against the damaging effects of ultraviolet radiation. So people with albinism suffer with sunburn more frequently, they suffer from skin cancers more frequently, and from premature aging. And as I said, they also experience a long list of ocular problems. There's another skin condition that is related to melanin production, and that's the condition called vitiligo. Now, unlike albinism, vitiligo is actually an autoimmune disorder, and it is a disorder that is not completely understood at this time. We don't understand the complete mechanism, the complete physiology of this disorder, and we don't know whether or not it's inherited, although it has been shown that it can run in families. In vitiligo, the immune system becomes sensitized to the melanocytes in the stratum basale, and it begins to attack and destroy the melanocytes as though they were foreign invaders. The strange thing about vitiligo is the strange distribution of the loss of melanocytes. In other words, it doesn't tend to affect all of the melanocytes, only a certain proportion of them. The regions where the melanocytes are destroyed then no longer contain melanin and become much lighter and whiter. These areas of depigmentation usually have very sharp margins associated with them. Now, vitiligo is more common in women, and of course it's more visible in people of color because of course their skin is darker to begin with. So when they lose pigment, it just shows up more than it does in people who have lighter skin. The next layer above the stratum basale is called the stratum spinosum. And unlike the stratum basale, the stratum spinosum has several layers of cells. Most of those cells are going to be cuboidal in shape, although some of them will have multiple sides. They'll be polyhedral. The types of cells that you'll find in the stratum spinosum are primarily keratinocytes, and also immune cells, again called Langerhans cells. The keratinocytes, remember, are coming up from the stratum basale. They are going to mature and they're going to start to produce keratin, and they will eventually replace those dead keratinocytes up at the top layers of the skin. The Langerhans cells, these immune cells that are found in the stratum spinosum, are similar to the melanocytes in that these are dendritic cells. These are cells that have strange tentacles of membrane coming off of their surface. On this slide, we can see both an artist's drawing of the integument over on the right and a light microscope image on the left. If you start right here, this is stratum basale, the very bottom layer of the epidermis. So all of this is epidermis. And down below in this lighter colored area, this is dermis. Over in the actual light microscope image, the stratum basale would be right at the base of this purple region. So everything above that is epidermis, and everything below, down here, is dermis. Remember, the stratum basale is one layer of cells. Directly above that one layer is stratum spinosum. So under the light microscope, the stratum spinosum is all of this layer of light purple cells. Well, if you go back to the drawing, all of this is stratum spinosum. Notice that a lot of these cells look cuboidal. Some of them look like polyhedrons, though, but largely cuboidal. Remember, the nucleus is located right in the center of these cuboidal cells. You can see one lone Langerhans cell drawn in yellow here, and I think you can just make out that that cell is sending out membrane tentacles out into the rest of the tissue.